Iraqi forces backed by the US-led coalition are pushing deeper into the densely populated areas of western Mosul in a bid to liberate the city from Islamic State terrorists. The UN says that more than 150,000 people have fled the conflict there as the latest anti-terror offensive goes into a second month. As the battle for the city intensifies, more reports of civilian casualties are emerging. This is an 8-year-old girl named Dua who was severely injured in an airstrike in Mosul. Both of her parents and several other members of her family were reportedly killed in the strike. Local resident Turki Ahmad found her lying in the street and took her to a camp being used as a makeshift hospital. We spoke to him and the camp's founder.
جتنا من البارحة قصف كان عندهم جابوا المخيمات من المخيمات جابوها لنا استقبلناها وهسه راح نحيل احنا للقيارة لانه حروق ومتأذية كل الشوارع صار 12 يوم قصف مكثف 12 يوم يعني قصف من البارحة من الساعة 7 الصبح بدأ إلى الساعة 4 يلا انتهى قصف مو طبيعي يعني تهدمت تقريبا 30-40 بيت انهدم إذا مو أكثر ويعني خسائر بشرية بالمئات.
Thousands of civilians are fleeing from Islamic State and the US-led coalition's bombing campaign in Mosul. RT's Murat Gaziev filed this report from the battlefield.
They promised us a pinpoint-accurate bombing campaign. Only terrorists, they said, are targets. Accurate or no, given the amount of airstrikes on Mosul, it might as well have been carpet-bombed.
For all their talk of precision, I haven't yet seen a single house in Mosul untouched by fighting. ISIS makes sure not to give up a square meter without a fight, and the Iraqi army and the US-led coalition seem to make sure to not leave a square meter unscorched.
Barely a kilometer from here, ISIS and Iraqi troops are fighting at the gates of the old city. Our escorts forbid us from going where we wanted, for security reasons, they said. But by strange coincidence, the streets they took us to showed a lot less damage than those in the distance, which had evidently been all but leveled by bombs. Every so often, we'd see civilians being driven out by Iraqi soldiers. Haunted eyes, dirty clothes, dust-covered faces, the obvious signs of people who had been through too much. And it's not easy getting them out.
The US-led coalition has apparently been striking at important transport hubs here in Mosul, like this crossroads, other crossroads as well as roundabouts, so that ISIS couldn't move reinforcements to and fro across the city. The side effect of that has been that it's incredibly difficult to reach refugees, for ambulances, for food to go into the city.
With progress slow and casualties high, the Iraqi army and the US-led coalition need every advantage they can get, even if it comes at a steep cost to civilians. Walking through Mosul, we saw that almost every door had been kicked in, almost every shop broken into, goods, people's possessions strewn about. There's No way to tell if this was Iraqi soldiers looking for ISIS stragglers or if it was looters. Perhaps both. Regardless, there's no one left to complain. Barely any civilians are left in the liberated parts of western Mosul. A handful stayed to protect their possessions. Others just didn't want to leave their homes. And all supported the Iraqi army. Better this, they said, than living under ISIS. This is the reality of war. Forget any talk of surgical precision or smart weapons. You can take precautions, establish safeguards, but civilians are still going to die. That is the price of liberation. Mourad Yazdiev, RT, from Mosul, Iraq.
Our Washington correspondent Gana Chichikan went to the U.S. State Department for its account of the humanitarian crisis in Mosul.
Operating in densely populated parts of western Mosul, it appears that Iraqi forces with U.S. support have increasingly turned to airstrikes and artillery in their operations against ISIL. With this, we see more and more accounts of locals describing situations where strikes hit not only houses where ISIL is located, but also nearby buildings, killing civilians. I asked the State Department if the U.S. was doing anything to change the manner in which the bombings were carried out. This was the response.
In direct response to your question, yes. When there are credible claims of civilian casualties, they're investigated by the U.S. military or by the Iraqi security forces. Reports are made, assessments are made, and any corrective measures are taken to avoid any regrettable incidents in the future.
Since the beginning of its operations in western Mosul last month, the U.S.-led coalition has not acknowledged any civilian casualties. Based on our interviews with locals who escaped from the fighting, there could be many.
الشر خفنا والله يعني عيشتنا الشر صارت يعني واحد يقصف المعمل وبيته وراعي بيته زلمته يروح يعني شنو حالاتها وظلنا كل مسكننا
الطيارة نعم ضربته ايه الحرب ضربته ما خلت فيكم شيء نهائيا كل شيء بس طلعنا يعني بس احنا عوينا الطرق قلتين وطلعنا
دحق على الشناين مالنا بس الدم يصب من عندهم هسه مختارين المستشفى الاخر.
Mosul residents trying to escape and not being able to get help is a big problem right now. A father of a 5-year-old girl who was badly injured in an airstrike last week said it took them 3 days to get her to the hospital. Here's what I asked the State Department. What does the U.S. do to help people exit the fighting and get help?
They do, and I can get you more details, but obviously we've been working in conjunction with the UN, but Iraqi security forces in creating corridors to get civilians out safely. We had set up with the UN basically refugee facilities and camps so that those displaced by the fighting in Mosul could find temporary shelter.
The UN says humanitarian agencies expect over 300,000 more civilians to flee Mosul in the coming weeks. And the UN Secretary General's deputy spokesperson, Farhan Haq, has warned that the crisis could get worse. We heard from him and other human rights groups.
The situation in Mosul gets worse. It's hard for people to leave the areas that they're in. At the same time, there's a lot of people who need to be able to leave freely to get to areas of safety. But our humanitarian workers have been hearing from the people who've been leaving in recent days that because of the fighting, because of explosive devices in different parts of the city, it's hard for them to move around. And the fact of the matter is that we anticipate that in the coming days, as many as 300,000 to 320,000 people may want to leave the parts of Mosul, including western Mosul, where they've been.
The fighting is intensifying in Mosul, and as a result, displacement is intensifying. So as the fighting intensifies in the densely populated western parts, obviously there is a heightened risk for civilians and for civilian casualties. Dangers come from the air, but the dangers also come from the ground. Well, we've also heard some very harrowing testimony from those who have come out of Mosul about being shot at, snipers aiming for them. Those who do flee run a huge range of risks. But at the same time, those who stay are also facing a huge range of risks.
Children in particular
are affected by what's happening. Many of them are experiencing very difficult traumatic experiences. The situation that children are living inside Mosul is very, very dire, and we are concerned of over 200,000 children that are now, as we speak, in areas that are the right side of Mosul.
Civilians are suffering the most in the city's struggle to rid it of terrorists. Another young girl from Mosul has been left fighting for her life after her home was hit by an airstrike. The report coming up contains some more distressing images. Hura is 5 years old, the same age as Omar Daknish, the young boy on the right of your screen, whose image became a tragic symbol of the war in Syria. However, Hura's story and the desperate situation in Mosul has not yet received the same media attention.
Russia and the Syrian government are launching an offensive. Hospitals are targets in Syria, and the regime has been bombing them ruthlessly.
Millions more displaced without a home. Now that includes Omran. And what strikes me is we shed tears, but there are no tears here. He doesn't cry once.
The Western media showed total understanding for the operations carried out with all the so-called collateral damage in Iraq, but showed zero understanding for the need of the Syrian armed forces and the Russians in a very, very similar case in Aleppo. The only difference is that the Syrians and the Russians are cast as the bad guys, while in Mosul, of course, the West and the Iraqi government forces are the good guys. It's as simple as that. In fact, the suffering in Mosul is greater than the suffering was in Aleppo, which was already bad enough, but the numbers are much higher, and the pictures we see are, if anything, even more horrifying. No, it's a case of double standards, very simply.
Now we're following the situation in the region closely, and you can follow the situation there as if you were on the ground.